In 1964, Soviet scientists at the Institute of Biological Problems of Aging in the Siberian town of Novosibirsk had an idea that changed history. What was supposed to be an ordinary experiment would turn into the darkest in human history. How did they manage to keep a person awake for 264 hours without sleep? What did they discover about the human body? And what side effects did the test subjects suffer from? You'll find out in this video. But before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss any new and interesting videos. The first stage. The researchers didn't want to just keep a person awake for as long as possible, though that would have been a crazy goal in itself. They were interested in studying how a person's biological functions change when they're deprived of sleep. At that time, scientists had already discovered that sleep is necessary for mental and physical health. However, there were questions that remained unanswered. Would a person's brain continue to function normally if they didn't sleep? Would their cardiovascular system suffer? What would happen to their metabolism? That's why it was decided to carry out an experiment called the Sleepless. They began by recruiting volunteers. It wasn't easy to find people willing to participate in such a dangerous experiment. Scientists needed people who were absolutely healthy, between 20 and 30 years old, and physically fit. A lot of young men wanted to take part, but they accepted only 2 candidates. The first was a radio operator named Shifrin, and the second was a physics professor named Knyazev. These men went through rigorous medical tests, and they were kept in complete isolation for 10 days before the experiment started. Their meals consisted only of vitamins and nutrients. As soon as the clock struck 0, both of them were given a sedative. This was to put them in a state of relaxation so they could fall asleep faster. However, they never fell asleep. As it turned out, the scientists had made a mistake by giving the men the medicine. They were supposed to stay awake during the entire experiment. The whole point was to see what would happen if a person didn't sleep at all. But now that they were under the influence of the sedative, they slept for 18 hours. After that, the medicine wore off, and the scientists got down to work. They provided the test subjects with coffee and food, and engaged them in various activities that required concentration. They also played loud music to keep them from falling asleep. However, after a while, both participants dozed off again, although they hadn't slept for 36 hours. They needed something stronger than coffee. After Shifrin and Knyazev had stayed awake for 72 hours, they started suffering from hallucinations. Their behavior became erratic and unpredictable. They couldn't answer simple questions correctly, and often didn't understand what was being asked of them. Scientists thought that maybe they hadn't given enough sedative, so they gave the men another dose, but it didn't help. They were losing their minds right before the eyes of the researchers. They began to babble nonsense and even tried to harm themselves. That's why the doctors had to stop the experiment and put the men to bed. Of course, these results were disappointing, but the scientists had learned a lot. The data they collected was enough to publish a paper. And that's exactly what they did. The world learned about the consequences of sleep deprivation. Scientists wrote that after 72 hours, a person loses the ability to concentrate, becomes aggressive, and can't perform logical actions. But this study wasn't over yet. In 1965, a new series of sleepless experiments was carried out. Everything was almost the same as before, but there was one important difference. This time, the scientists didn't give the participants any sedatives. The first volunteer for this experiment was a certain Mr. Ivanov. He spent 456 hours awake. During this time, he lost 15 kilograms. He experienced severe visual and auditory hallucinations. His skin became dry and his eyes were bloodshot. He also suffered from hypertension, tachycardia, and his overall condition worsened greatly. Then the scientists decided to try something new. The next 3 volunteers had to spend 2 weeks in a soundproofed room. They weren't allowed to sleep, eat, or drink. The scientists fed them intravenously. All 3 men quickly started suffering from hallucinations and depression. In addition, they became extremely skinny. Their faces were pale and their eyes were sunken. At first, they walked around the room restlessly, but later they lay in bed all day. In this position, they spent most of their time until the moment they were declared medically dead. Autopsy showed that death had occurred due to heart failure caused by exhaustion. Apparently, our body simply can't function without sleep. However, there was one case when a man managed to stay awake for a really long time. That was Randy Gardner, an American teenager who set a world record by staying awake for 11 days and 25 minutes. He participated in a scientific experiment conducted by doctors at the University of California. Randy watched TV, played games, and talked with friends. Of course, at some point, he began to experience hallucinations and suffer from memory loss. But when the doctors decided to stop the experiment, Randy didn't want to go to bed. He felt great, although according to the doctors, his heart was beating much slower than usual, and his reaction was slow. But after a few hours of sleep, Randy's health noticeably improved. Can we live without sleep? Maybe for a while. But then serious consequences will follow. It's better not to test your body to the limit and get enough sleep every night. There are also cases when people didn't sleep for several years. This sounds unbelievable, but it's true. People claim that they simply don't need sleep, and they can live perfectly well without it. However, doctors say that this is impossible. According to research, even if a person doesn't sleep for 11 days, their brain won't be able to function properly. Another thing to consider is that there's no objective measure of sleep. That's why people can claim that they haven't slept for several years, but it won't be possible to prove it. There was even a case when a woman woke up from a coma after 20 years. Can you imagine what would happen to her if she hadn't woken up? It means she didn't sleep for 20 years, which is absolutely impossible. However, scientists recently discovered something incredible. Deep sleep is essential for the human body because it allows the brain to restore its activity. However, it turns out that deep sleep isn't necessary for everyone. Researchers have found a rare genetic mutation that allows a person to wake up feeling refreshed without sleeping for 8 hours a night. Doctors examined 2 families in which people didn't need sleep. The first family lived in Colombia, and the second one was from the USA. Genetic testing showed that all members of these families had a mutation of the gene called ADRA2A. This gene is responsible for producing the hormone orexin. Orexin helps regulate sleep and wakefulness. When the gene mutates, orexin stops being produced. That's why people with this mutation don't need sleep. But if a person receives a dose of orexin, they immediately feel sleepy. It's safe to say that this is a unique case, and there are not many people who do not need sleep. Although science has come a long way, there are still many things we don't know about the human body. If you think you've learned everything, you'll be surprised. Do you know what happens to your body when you eat ice cream? Leave a comment and find out in the next video. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new and interesting videos.